the heart of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, the Zahir, which we could say is a philosophical short story, and perhaps even something that strays over into the horror genre, is what happens once one starts not just encountering, but thinking about the Zahir. And the character Borges, who we've already been introduced to earlier on, is going to have a number of reflections that are spurred by the coin, one of them being that money is the future, and then another being that one coin can stand in for any other coin. And he is going to tell us, I had no suspicion at the time that these, in quote, thoughts were an artifice against the Zahir and a first manifestation of its demonic influence. So, two sets of reflections and a double-sided, much like a coin, function to these thoughts that he's having. And so the next day, he decides, I had been drunk, I decided to free myself of the coin that was affecting me so distressingly. I looked at it. There was nothing particularly distinctive about it except those scratches. Burying it in the garden or hiding it in the corner of the library would have been the best thing to do. But I wanted to escape its orbit altogether and so preferred to, again, in quotes, lose it. So he goes into an area and he walks towards the west and south. I turned left and right with studied randomness at several corners, and on a street that looked to me like all the others, I went into the first tavern I came to, ordered a brandy, and paid with these here. I half closed my eyes, even behind the dark lenses of my spectacles, and managed not to see the numbers on the houses or the name of the street. So he thinks he has managed to get rid of it, and indeed, physically he has. But the Zahir has got its claws into him, so to speak. And we read that he tries to distract himself by composing a tale of fantasy. He tells us some things about it. Borges himself loved studying and analyzing metaphors, so he tells us about enigmatic circumlocutions like sword water instead of blood and dragon's bed for gold. He tells us that the narrator is an ascetic who's renounced all commerce with mankind and lives on a kind of moor. And eventually, we're going to learn that he's actually the serpent Fafnir, and the treasure on which the creature lies coiled is the gold of the Nibelungen. So he's basically taken an older story and done the modern thing of giving it a new twist, looking at it through the eyes of one of the, not just characters, but creatures within it. And so he's got this fantasy tale that helps him to distract himself. And he says, I have said that composing that piece of trivial nonsense in the course of which I interpolated with pseudo-erudition a line or two from the Fafnir Mall enabled me to put the coin out of my mind. And so now he does something foolish. He trusts his own capacities too much. He says, there were nights when I was so certain I'd be able to forget it, I would willfully remember it. Sort of like somebody who knows that the fire will burn but gets their finger close to it and sometimes even fans it through just to prove to themselves that they can. That is a foolish thing to do because, he says, the truth is I abuse those moments. Starting to recall turned out to be much easier than stopping. And this is how he goes into his decline. He tells himself, it was futile to reflect that that abominable nickel disc was no different than the infinite other identical inoffensive discs that pass from hand to hand every day. I attempted to think about another coin, but he couldn't. And here is where he gets his hands on actual physical coins and spends time doing experiments with Chilean 5 and 10 centavo pieces and a Uruguayan 2 centavo piece. He acquires a pound sterling. That night he places it under a magnifying glass and studies it in the light of a powerful electric lamp, and even makes a rubbing of it. And he says, "The ray of light in the dragon in St. George availed me not. I could not rid myself of my idée fixe," which is a psychiatric term for an idea that you've got stuck in your head and you can't free yourself of. That is what the Zahir has now become to him. And he goes to a psychiatrist, doesn't tell him the entire story, but he does tell him that he could not free his mind of the image of an object, any random object, a coin, say. And we don't read that that helps him at all, but he does, in a bookstore, get a copy of a very important volume, Julius Barlach's Urkunden zur Geschichte der Zahir Saga. So this is a book specifically about the Zahir. And he says, between the covers of that book was a description of my illness. So now he's recognizing it as an actual illness. So the introduction says the author proposed to gather into a single manageable octavo volume every existing document that bears upon the superstition of the Zahir. What do we learn from Borges' account of this fictional book? Well, that the belief in the Zahir is of Islamic ancestry. It shows up within the Muslim world, and it's not really that old. According to the book, it stems from the 18th century. In Arabic, Zahir means visible, manifest, evident. In that sense, it is one of the 99 names of God. In Muslim countries, the masses use the word for beings or things which have the terrible power to be unforgettable and whose image eventually drives people mad. And so we're going to get a bunch of examples, some of which were provided at the very beginning of the story. So there is an astrolabe. We learn that in a certain school in Shiraz, there was a copper astrolabe constructed in such a way that any man who looked upon it but once could think of nothing else, so that the king commanded it be thrown into the deepest depths of the sea in order that men might not forget the universe. Going back to the beginning of the story, we learn that it was also a blind man in the Surakarta Mosque, stoned by the faithful. We get another reference to the astrolabe. In the prisons of Mahdi in 1892, a small sailor's compass wrapped in a shred of cloth from a turban that Rudolf Karl von Sloten touched. In the synagogue in Cordoba, according to Zotenberg, a vein in the marble of one of the 1,200 pillars. In the ghetto in Tetuan, the bottom of a well. So it can take on a lot of different shapes. And one of the shapes that we find out about is that of the tiger. So it's actually become an expression according to this work. Verily, he has looked upon the tiger, meaning madness or saintliness. The reference was to a magic tiger that was the perdition of all who saw it, even from a great distance, for never afterward could a person stop thinking about it. And we learn about one of these stricken people who painted the image of the tiger in a palace. Now, what is the image? Does the image have the same effects as the tiger itself? The image is something quite different. We learn that there is an infinite tiger painted in a cell by someone who originally intended to draw a map of the world. So here is the description. There's a cell whose floors, walls, and vaulted ceiling were covered by a drawing in barbaric colors that time before obliterating had refined of an infinite tiger. Now, what is an infinite tiger? A tiger composed of many tigers in the most dizzying of ways. It was crisscrossed with tigers, striped with tigers, and contained seas and Himalayas and armies that resembled other tigers. Can you picture that to yourself? Can you imagine that? What a prospect it is. So this is his attempt to externalize what it is that he has seen. And we see that the narrator can also see the coin from both sides of the coin in his description a little bit later on. This is what happens to you when you've become obsessed with the object that is the Zahir. And we further read that Muhammad al-Yemeni said that there was no creature in the world that did not tend towards becoming a Zahir. Now, this is a very interesting way of saying it, right? There's no creature in the world that can't become a Zahir. That's more neutral. That tends toward it. Anything that we experience could become the Zahir and already has a tendency towards that. But there is an upside. There's bad news, good news. So the good news is only one object can be a Zahir at any given time. That's Allah's decree, since a single one is capable of entrancing multitudes. Now, his account traces Zahir backwards into the age of ignorance before the coming of the prophet. It was the idol called Yahuk, and then a prophet from Khorasan who wore a veil spangled with precious stones, or a mask of gold. And we see that the narrator, Borges, experiences a number of emotions. These are very important and interesting. They are responses to this situation. What are they? Desperation, relief, envy, and uneasiness. So, desperation, why? I realized nothing could any longer save me. I'm trapped, and that's it. Inward relief of knowing I was not to blame for my misfortune. It's something else that's happening to me. Envy for those whose Zahir was not a coin but a slab of marble or a tiger. Why? How easy it is not to think of a tiger, but that's kind of a silly idea. A coin, a tiger, just as easy to think of. And then remarkable uneasiness. Why? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. So we find out that he is not the only one who is in thrall to the Zahir. There is also Teoladina's sister, Yulita, Sister Abakal, right? So we find out that this woman says she's become so odd. She's been put into Bosch, which is a mental institution. She's going on and on about that coin, just like Morena Slackman's chauffeur. So now we know that 3 people are in the thrall of the Zahir. And the narrator says, going back to this, it is not as though the Zahir were made of glass, since one side is not superimposed on another. It's rather as though the vision were itself spherical, with the Zahir rampant in the center. Anything that is not the Zahir comes to me as through a filter and from a distance. So Tennyson said, if we could understand but a single flower, we might know who we are and what the world is. Perhaps he was trying to say there is nothing, however humble, that does not imply the history of the world and its infinite concatenation of causes and effects. Perhaps he was trying to say that the visible world can be seen entire in every image, just as Schopenhauer tells us that the will expresses itself entire in every man and woman. The Kabbalists believe that man is a microcosm, a symbolic mirror of the universe. If one were to believe Tennyson, everything would be, even the unbearable Zahir. And now Borges realizes that Julia's fate is going to overtake him. He's no longer perceiving the universe. He is perceiving the Zahir. And he says, I won't know who the man Borges was. Now, is this a bad thing happening to him? That's where we run into the question, is this actually a horror story? So he says, calling that future terrible is a fallacy, since none of the future circumstances will in any way affect me. One may as well call terrible the pain of an anesthetized patient whose skull is being trepanned. I will no longer perceive the universe, I will perceive the Zahir. For me, thousands upon thousands of appearances will pass into one. A complex dream will pass into a simple one. Others will dream I am mad, while I will dream of the Zahir. While every man on earth thinks day and night of the Zahir, which will be dream and which reality, the earth or the Zahir. So what else is going on? I said there was some possibly good news. And this goes back to the uneasiness that he feels. Why? Because he read this paragraph, one commentator of the Gulshani Raz states that he who has seen the Zahir soon shall see the rose, and quotes a line of poetry interpolated into Attar's Asar Nama, the Book of Things Unknown. The Zahir is the shadow of the rose and the rending of the veil. He brings that up again, that passage, and says that I'm trying not to think or trying to think about that passage. I link that pronouncement to this fact in order to lose themselves in God. The Sufis repeat their own name or the 99 names of God until the names mean nothing anymore. I long to travel that path. Perhaps by thinking about the Zahir unceasingly, I can manage to wear it away. Perhaps behind the coin is God. Is it? We don't know. We have no way of determining that from the frame of the story. These are conjectures. But it's clear that there is an idée fixe that dominates this man as well as others in his narrative universe, and that perhaps there is something positive to come out of this and not just madness or illness.